Thanks for coming again. So this seminar, this paper is based on some research that I did this year, and it's currently under review. So it's like a draft version, so that it might change later on. But I just wanted to share the research that I've been doing about comics makers attending zine fairs in Australia, and this idea of community over industry. All right, so what I want to say before I start is how I got into this research topic. So when my interest in zines and comics started when I was a child and living in Turkey. And when I wrote and illustrated a few pages of comics and stapled them together to make my first book at the age of 9. And I didn't know actually in 25 years' time, I would be doing the exact same thing on the other side of the world in Australia. So I had this DIY, do-it-yourself bug all through my teenage years. And in my early 20s, I made zines. I played in the local rock and metal bands. I traded tapes, letters, and flyers. And I generally supported the underground. And when I migrated to Australia in my mid-20s and pursued a PhD, I actually took a break from these practices and spaces. And I only found my way to the indie art and zine spaces of Australia as a practitioner after I completed my PhD back in 2013, 10 years ago. What I discovered in the next decade was a vibrant small press and independent publishing ecology made up of zine makers and cartoonists who do what they do for the love of creativity and community. According to Broken Pencil, the magazine of zine culture and independent arts, the Australian zine scene is likely the largest in the world. Multiple zine fairs are held across the country every year. The larger fairs, such as Other Worlds Zine Fair and the Festival of the Photocopier, are attended by hundreds of people. The National Library of Australia, as well as some state libraries, hold sizable zine collections, especially State Library of Victoria. Melbourne has a dedicated zine shop called the Sticky Institute, which has been operating since 2001. Zine Fair organisers note a growing number of stallholder applications in the last decade as well. Local councils, arts funding bodies, libraries, museums, and art galleries fund or host zine-related events, such as workshops, panels, talks, and fairs. My involvement in Australia's zine scene began when I applied for and got accepted for a stall at the inaugural Other Worlds Zine Fair in 2014. I had 2 zines for sale, both of which were comics. I shared a table with Australian graphic novelist Pat Grant, who was selling his new Riso-printed comic, Tormina Video. And I noticed in that first year that many stallholders were fellow comics makers. The poster for the zine fair was designed by comic artist Nicky Minus, featuring colorful and psychedelic portraits of women in comic-style panels in sequence. The zine and alternative comic scenes of Australia have long enjoyed an affinity, largely due to a shared appreciation of self-publishing and the sense of community afforded to participants in the zine scenes. I did write my involvement in the zine community and comics community recently in a publication which was in Continuum. So if anyone's interested, you can find that online in Continuum, or you can just send me an email if you want a copy, if you can't access it because of a paywall. And I detail some of my involvement in the community there as well. So in this paper, what I want to do is I investigate the place of zine fairs in the comics ecosystem of Australia through autoethnographic and ethnographic methodologies, as an active participant in zine and comic scenes through creative practice and event organization. So since 2015, I have been a member of the Other Worlds Collective and helped coordinate the annual Other Worlds Zine Fair and other related projects such as a zine subscription service. And I have become a part of a textual community, as Kate Icon defines. So these are communities that emerge when people are brought together through a shared text, a shared set of texts, or a shared set of reading and writing practices. The Zine Fair is one of the few spaces this mostly textual and virtual community comes together in a physical space. For many of us, it may be the one time in the year we get to see each other or to have a chance to catch up. And in addition to my participant observations in the field, tabling as a zine maker at more than a dozen zine fairs since 2014, I also rely on qualitative data from interviews I held with 20 makers and organizers who have been involved in zine fairs as stallholders or volunteers. So in this paper, I will provide sometimes direct quotes from my interviewees to ensure that their voices are represented here too. So after providing an overview of zines and zine fairs in Australia, I will give a brief autoethnographic account of Other Worlds Zine Fair with perspectives from the organizers. And then I will talk about comics and zines and how they relate to each other, whether we can consider comics as zines, and I will get some quotes from comics makers who make zines. And then we'll talk about some of the tensions, I guess, that arise from sometimes comics makers attending zine fairs, especially if they are publishing professionally printed comics and sell them at zine fairs. So to start with, I guess, giving a definition of what a zine is would be appropriate, and why should we be interested in zines as a media format. So zines are amateur publications created, printed, usually photocopied, assembled and distributed by one or more people in small runs. The word zine is an abbreviation from fanzine, which was a neologism that combined fan and magazine. According to Till Triggs, fanzine itself first appeared abbreviated to zine sometime in the 1970s, describing a photocopied, stapled, non-commercial and non-professional small circulation publication. An influential figure in the Australian zine scene, Luke Sinclair, adds, "Zines are always made for love and not for profit." As elsewhere in the English-speaking world, the history of zines in Australia begins with science fiction fanzines and fan cultures in the 1940s. So fanzines like Antipodes or the Futurian Society of Sydney's newsletter were the first fanzines in Australia. And then zines continued to flourish in the punk underground scenes in the 1970s and 80s. Science fiction zines and newsletters were often published by clubs to be mailed out to the members, and punk fanzines were sold at record stores or at punk gigs. Luke Sinclair of the Melbourne-based zine shop Sticky Institute recalls encountering music zines at all ages indie rock and punk shows in the early 1990s in Melbourne. He later discovered zines focusing on themes other than music through the now defunct Polyester Books in Melbourne, which stocked books on subcultures, underground literature, and fringe art, among other topics. This discovery led Luke to create zines with his friends and later individually as well. Hon Boy and Emma D, who are two of the organizers of the Other Worlds Zine Fair in Sydney, similarly discovered zines in the 1990s through the punk subculture and started making their own zines around the same time. Alongside the punk and indie music scene, a new subculture of zine making that married the personal with the political was emerging in the 1990s as well. According to Emma D, so these are some of the examples of her zines. So according to Emma D, in these zines, the focus would always be everyday life, as in the politics of everyday life. And the intention was always connecting with like-minded people. I would add here that most of these people were girls. The zine scene then, from my perspective, was very much about girls and young women creating networks through zines, letter writing, and DIY culture in order to connect with each other and ultimately, this will sound like an exaggeration, but it's true, to change the world. The scene we have today is very much built on the labor of those mostly anonymous girls and young women, I think. End of quote. The perzine was a common genre of zines in both Australia and the United States in the 1990s and early 2000s. Anna Poletti examines Australian perzines as a mode of autobiographical writing by a demographic that are not commonly associated with writing autobiographies, young people. Rather than approaching zines as a subculture associated with youth resistance like previous researchers, Poletti analyzes perzines as unique narratives of the self, constituted by a textual community. The popularity of the perzine could easily have waned through the spread of online modes of communication, blogging, and social media networks in the early 2000s. But even the most seasoned zine makers admit that they thought the internet would eventually kill the zine scene. However, the opposite seems to have happened. By all accounts, as many of my interviewees told me in these exact same words, the zine scene in Australia is very healthy. The enduring influence of zines has attracted attention in mainstream media in the 2000s, in academia and in the art world, as well as in the press. But zines still continue to be considered part of an underground culture. As Anna Poletti argues, zines are not easy to find unless you know where to look, and their lifespan as objects circulating in a particular economy is short. Australian zines are circulated by three main strategies: commission selling through online distributors and sympathetic stores, direct distribution of zines at zine fairs and markets, and individual postal circulation. End of quote. So while the main distribution of zines was through the Australian postal system, and this sort of created what Kate Icon and Anna Poletti described as a textual community. What my focus is in this in this paper is looking at the physical spaces of this textual community, the zine community, which is the zine fairs in Australia. So, zine makers around Australia started traveling across state borders to attend the This Is Not Art Festival Zine Fair, TINA, held annually in Newcastle from 1998 to 2019. Luke Sinclair recalls that TINA Zine Fair was the only large national zine fair and it galvanized people nationally, end of quote. And that, quote, zines were a big emphasis of the festival in 1998, but they moved away from zines as they got new coordinators. The zine fair still happened, but zines were less and less of a focus, end of quote. Emma D adds, quote, when I eventually got to TINA in 2004 or 5, it was wonderful, but it also seemed like a bit of a different scene. People were actually interested in being professional writers, artists. It really hadn't occurred to me that you could harbor ambitions like that, end of quote. The first decade of the 21st century saw the emergence of many other zine fairs in Australia, often within the context of larger music or art events, such as the Belladonna DIY Festival Zine Fair in Wollongong, Adelaide Fringe Festival Zine Fair, and the Sydney Writers Festival Zine Fair, which later became the Museum of Contemporary Art Zine Fair in 2008. 2008 was also the first year one of Australia's longest-running annual zine fairs. Melbourne's The Festival of the Photocopier was organized. Conceived by the Sticky Institute, the first Festival of the Photocopier was an ambitious undertaking with 30 days of zine events, which concluded with a zine fair. Luke Sinclair recalls a need to organize a new zine fair in Melbourne during that time because Express Media, which was a not-for-profit writing and media organization for young artists, was no longer invested in organizing a zine fair after doing it a few times. And of course, there's the Other Worlds Zine Fair, which started quite a few years later. So in the second decade of the 21st century, an increasing number of zine fairs were being independently organized by zine makers themselves. This could be seen as an extension of the DIY attitude and arising from the discomfort of being at the whim of institutional gatekeepers and their changing priorities. So one of Australia's largest zine fairs, Other Worlds Zine Fair, partially emerged as a reaction to the institutional nature of the Museum of Contemporary Art Zine Fair. Bonboy and MRD relate the conception of the Other Worlds Zine Fair to the artists' boycott of the Sydney Biennale in 2014, which was due to the Biennale's sponsorship by Transfield, a corporation that operated service contracts in the detention centers on Manus Island and Nauru. Noting that the MCA was also sponsored by the same corporation, Emma and the partner Tim published a post on their Take Care Zine distro blog saying they will be boycotting the MCA Zine Fair. Honboy contacted them and suggested running an alternative zine fair to the MCAs on the same day as a form of protest. The Other Worlds Zine Fair was supported and attended by Sticky Institute from Melbourne and the Sydney-based community art organization, the Refugee Art Project. I joined the volunteer organizing team of Other Worlds in 2015, along with a group of Sydney and Melbourne-based zine makers and cartoonists to help run the second edition of the Zine Fair. Other Worlds was held on the same weekend as the MCA Zine Fair in 2015, as there were still questions around MCA's sponsorship by Transfield. However, after the first year of Other Worlds, protesting the MCA Zine Fair gradually became less of a focus. The organizers recognized the importance of providing a grassroots and politically engaged alternative to the institutionally organized zine fairs, such as MCAs. Honboy remembers MCA dropped Transfield, and there was a period when we thought, do we want to keep doing this? To which Bailey Sharp, one of the other organizers, replies, apart from the Transfield connection, there was also this feeling that the MCA Zine Fair was also kind of washed. It was a bit big and cookbook, cupcake. It was almost full of more marketable zines or zines that are not political or like a diversion from the classic zine culture, end of quote. Luke Sinclair adds that the MCA Zine Fair was, and I quote, definitely more designy. There were a lot more design people there and definitely a different clientele, end of quote. Part of the reason Other Worlds Zine Fair, the Festival of the Photocopier and other large annual zine fairs persisted for a decade or more is that they have been organized by zine makers for zine makers. According to Honboy, he questions what makes zines zines. It comes from bottom up. It's organized, created, and put out by people who are on the grounds, as opposed to an institution mandating. It relies on permission from larger institutions. That's the antithesis of what a zine fair should be. We still need to exist because I can't imagine one of the largest art institutions in Australia putting on a zine fair, because this is against what a zine fair should be. Reflecting on the place of zines and zine fairs in the broader art ecosystem in Australia, MRD comments, and I quote, zines don't need to be part of the arts ecosystem. I really hope the association of zines with art that's prevalent these days doesn't discourage people from making zines. You don't need to have an ambition to be an artist or writer or have a CV or career plan or pitch to make zines or have a table at Other Worlds. Zines are for everyone. Zines are maybe especially for those who don't know who or what they are or what they're doing. Zines are a way of figuring out, becoming, and making a community with others. Saying that, of course, zines are also art, and zine fairs are an important part of the larger arts ecosystem, because it is very hard to be a practicing artist, let alone a professional one. There just aren't that many opportunities, so we have to make our own opportunities. Zine fairs and other DIY events create space for people who are excluded for one reason or another. from the art world. They may or may not also be a route into that world, depending on your beliefs and perspective. That's why there need to be more zine fairs. Small fairs, big fairs, just more fairs. So next, I want to talk about how comics makers attend zine fairs and what motivates them to attend zine fairs. If you visit a zine fair in Australia, you're likely to see an abundance of comics on the tables. As two of the largest zine fairs in the country, approximately 1/3 of the stalls in the Festival of Photocopier and Other Worlds Zine Fair are given to comics makers. Michael Ficaris, a Melbourne-based artist, publisher, organizer, and veteran of the zine and comic scenes, believes that the number of comics makers in the zine scene is likely due to our lack of industry. He attends, and I quote, international comics-related festivals, which are far beyond what we are capable of offering generally, but I feel that the Sticky Zine Fair is one of the best zine fairs in the world for reasons stated above. In my experience, many international zine fairs have less comics per se. End of quote. Confirming Michael Ficaris' analysis, comic scholar Amy Louise Maynard traces the beginnings of the DIY culture in Australian comics to the period after 1959, when, she argues, the attempts to build a local comics publishing industry ended. She continues, and I quote, Australian comics production post-1975 has relied on entrepreneurial activity and the identification of social network markets, end of quote. Maynard also notes that the scarcity of funding and the lack of cultural policy for comics publishing is also a factor in comics remaining within the realms of alternative and independent publishing spheres. Most comic makers I interviewed attend 1 or 2 zine fairs per year. Only half of them travel or used to travel interstate to attend a zine fair. The main reason for not traveling interstate is the cost associated with it. Some comics makers try to coincide other projects or work with a zine fair happening in a different state to travel, but this is a rare occasion. It is worth that the COVID-19 pandemic, which led to lengthy lockdowns, restrictions to public gatherings, and travel as mandated by state governments in Australia, had an impact on zine fairs. As with most other public events, zine fairs moved largely online until 2022. Despite seemingly returning to normal, some comics makers mentioned that they have not attended a zine fair since the beginning of the pandemic measures. My interviews with comics makers from Australia suggest that for most of them, zine fairs provide a space for them to socialize with their peers. Sydney-based comics and zine maker Jin Yin Lau calls zine fairs, and I quote, a place to feel like a part of a community, end of quote. As well as zine fairs being, most other responses mentioned the word community, as well as zine fairs being an opportunity to meet or catch up with friends and other creators. Melbourne-based comics and zine maker Kim Lam says her favorite thing about zine fairs is being immersed in a scene full of caring, passionate, and interesting people who happen to also be interested in comics, illustration, art books, zines, self-published, writing, and things on the fringe, end of quote. According to Melbourne-based comics journalist, cartoonist, and labor activist Sam Wallman, zine fairs really help keep the comic ecosystem healthy. They help keep the practice of making comics and zines social, which is really important. Us comic and zine producers can be a reclusive bunch, so they're good at getting us all together, celebrating each other's work, and hyping each other up. Zine fairs push back against alienation that can be kind of inherent in producing solo work, end of quote. Emily Walsh, a zine and comics maker and event organizer based in Melbourne, echoes Waldman's words and says that her favorite thing about zine fairs is, and I quote, spending all the money I made buying other people's zines. The community, the drinks afterwards, the atmosphere, end of quote. Zine fairs serve multiple purposes for comics makers. For instance, Melbourne-based comics and zine maker Mandy Ord also sees zine fairs as a space to not only sell her work, but to meet her audience and buying zines and comics from other makers. Tasmania-based multidisciplinary artist and one of the organizers of the small press zine fair in Hobart, Josh Santospirito, agrees. Whilst, and I quote, whilst I would say it's mostly about community and socializing, it's also about getting a sense of who reads my work and making some key connections for future possible collaborations. I do make the strategic decision to attend interstate zine fairs the year prior to a larger book coming out, just to build some audience. I don't actually know if this works, but it makes me think that I'm doing something. But not all comics makers love zine fairs equally. One interviewee who wishes to remain anonymous commented, I used to attend more, but realized that as a neurodivergent person, I actually find the fair setup quite overwhelming, and it takes me days to recover. And I never sell very well, so I always have to accept that and wear the cost, which I sometimes can do, other times I can't. If a zine fair pays for artists with a grant, I'm more likely to come, but even then I have to be realistic about the impact it has on my energy and well-being. I also really dislike sitting for ages and people picking up my work, making shitty comments and putting it down. It can feel quite dejecting, actually. End of quote. I also ask my interviewees whether they attend any other comics-related events, such as comic cons, library events, and other comic art festivals. If they did, how their experiences compare to attending zine fairs. About a quarter of them reported not attending any other events. Others attend library-organized comics events or comic art festivals. However, all but one interviewee avoids attending Comic-Con type organizations. Some mention the cost of tables at Comic-Cons as a deterring factor, but the reluctance to attend Comic-Cons may be due to the profile of the comics makers who tend to attend zine fairs as well. Most of my interviewees could be categorized as alternative comics makers, while Comic-Cons tend to host mainstream comics artists, especially those who produce comics in the superhero genre, along with TV and film stars. Michael Hawkins is a cartoonist and Melbourne-based comics publisher from Glom Press. I think Glom Press as a publisher definitely fit in more at zine fairs than they would at a Comic-Con. More than half of my interviewees make autobiographical comics or graphic memoirs, which is a very common subgenre of alternative comics in the Anglophone world. I guess we can say that this is a point of intersection for the zine scene and the alternative comic scene, considering the popularity of the personal zines that I mentioned earlier. In fact, it might be argued that alternative cartoonists and zine makers share the hand in establishing autobiographical writing as a mode of countercultural expression among the youth through the 1980s and 1990s. This may explain why comics makers in Australia have an affinity with zine spaces, which they maintain even when they start publishing work more professionally. And that's a theme from a Comic-Con. All right, so next I want to talk about whether we can categorize comics as zines and whether graphic novels have a place in zine fairs and the idea of self-publishing and how they overlap in the zine spaces and comics publishing in Australia. So while comics makers hold stalls at zine fairs to meet their peers and readers, whether they regard their comics as zines is a bit more contentious. Most of them publish comics in other formats as well as zines, and they point to a distinction between the two formats of media. Melbourne-based comics maker Chris Gooch says, I mostly write and draw long-form comics or graphic novels. I don't consider the long comics I make zines, but I have made short comics and published them as zines before, end of quote. Louis Joyce is one of the rare comics makers whose work intersects in both mainstream comics publishing and the alternative underground zine spaces. So his work has been published by professional mainstream publishers, but he also publishes zines. He says he published everything from mini comics to mini-series and graphic novels. And I quote, "The stuff I will usually put into the zines category is the work that I've self-published, which is usually shorter form comics or art zines. Sometimes these might be printed and bound at a printer, but most often they're following some kind of DIY method where I'm choosing paper stocks and printing styles like Rizzo, and folding, stapling, binding, etc. myself." For Joyce, being a zine maker has had an impact on his development as a creator of comics and gave him a passion for self-publishing. Even when his work is published by professional publishers, he still likes being involved in decision-making in the design of the book, such as which paper stock to use. The decision-making process and the physical labor of producing a publication on one's own is part of the charms of being a part of the zine community for comics makers. For example, Sydney-based cartoonist Meg O'Shea describes the pleasures of her process. And she says, "Another thing I take enormous amounts of joy is the problem solving that comes with having to physically produce zines. Things like print layout, designing the zine as an object, and planning its production. For example, deciding that a little dumb story consisting of large images would be both legible and fun at matchbox size. Then after much trial and error, working out that the most efficient way to mass produce matchbox-sized zines is to print the internal pages as one long strip and concertina fold them before clamping between two bits of timber to manually perfect bind them. Then realizing that you can save time and make things neater by cutting each set of pages after binding, rather than before. Shit like that. It feels so good." End of quote. Despite a passion for self-publishing and zine making, most comics makers say they have or would like to be published by a traditional publisher. For example, Byron Bay-based comics and zine maker Holly English says, and I quote, "I only self-published when and if I finish my graphic novel, I would love to get a publisher." In a majority of my interviewees see zine making and self-publishing as one part of their practice, and see benefits of publishing with a traditional publisher. For example, Mandy Ode says, "Being published by publishers allows for more opportunities financially in terms of advances and royalties, more media opportunities and marketing support, as well as better avenues of distribution. Media exposure, articles and book reviews, as well as inclusion in literary prizes also creates public speaking and teaching opportunities, which are good income earners for creators. Working with publishers does involve less autonomy regarding editing and design input. As long as roles and degrees of input are determined and agreed to at the start, usually with a contract, then this sort of professional collaboration can work well. The expertise of industry professionals can elevate the finished product, the book. The only downside may be pressure to change work depending on said input. Creative control is no longer 100% with the author." End of quote. A Sydney-based artist, Safda Ahmed, who's I think here today as well, sees working with publishers as a positive thing, as it promises greater distribution and attention for my work. "I don't mind working with a publisher so long as their criticisms are constructive and attentive to the vision of my work, so doing their best to help realize my vision." End of quote. He also recognizes the importance of self-publishing for unhampered self-expression. Joyce Santos Espirito makes the relationship between comics, zines, and zine fair more complicated. And I quote, "I categorize the comics I make that are formatted as zines, i.e. the ones which are handmade, homemade, slim, stapled, published in small numbers, etc. But I also make graphic novels with a spine, printed in much larger quantities. And whilst the umbrella definition of zines is very rubbery and inclusive, I just don't believe it applies to my graphic novels, but I naughtily sell them at zine fairs anyway." Santos Espirito has a graphic novel coming out from a professional publisher in 2024. However, he has previously published two graphic novels, The Long Weekend in Alice Springs and Swallows Part 1, through his own publishing company, San Kesto. Like Santos Espirito, many comics makers I encounter at zine fairs sell sometimes self-published comics or graphic novels that have not necessarily been produced in the same principles as traditional zines. These books tend to have higher production values, like they're professionally printed and bound in higher quantities on glossy or other high-quality paper stock. The existence of professional-looking, though self-published works in the context of zine spaces generates attention. Luke Sinclair notes that while glossy publications may still be considered zines, they are not as likely to be sought after by zine readers who frequent the Sticky Institute zine shop in Melbourne. Those zine fans are after unique works that they may not find at bookstores or comic shops, and they may not want to pay the higher price that comes with glossier publications. Having published his graphic novel Still Alive, Notes from Australia's Immigration Detention System through 12 Panels Press in 2021 and Fantagraphics in 2022, Safdar Ahmed sells copies of the book along with his zines and self-published comics at Other Worlds Zine Fair, which has been the only fair he has attended in recent years. As an artist with a few graphic novels under his belt, Chris Gooch's approach to attending zine fairs is also similar. He says, if I'm mostly selling my books, graphic novels at a fair, I generally try to make a new small zine of sketches to sell for a gold coin alongside my books. End of quote. Zine fairs thus provide more established comics makers at a marketplace to sell their graphic novels. Chris Gooch notes that the book launches he organizes for his graphic novels are often less successful sales-wise to zine fairs. The Melbourne-based publisher Glom Press attends zine fairs, and I quote, because there are not many opportunities for us to table, says Ben Jews, one of the 4 comics makers running Glom Press, along with Bailey Sharp, Michael Hawkins, and Mark Pearson. They don't attend comic conventions, but they attend the less mainstream comics festivals like the Home Cooked Comics Festival in Melbourne. Glom Press specializes in publishing Rizzo-printed comics, and in their own words, they aim to fill a gap in the Australian publishing industry between mini comics and graphic novels, based on the Glom Press website. Being situated in this interstitial space, they also experience a slight discomfort with attending zine fairs at times. Bailey Sharp says they ask themselves if they still belong to zine fairs. And I quote, "It is an open question, and I wouldn't be surprised if someone said no," end of quote. According to Sharp, they can get the books across the line to be sold at bookstores, but the production values of the risograph printed books may vary and are not always perfect. As a book publisher, Glom Press still works with DIY principles and handle all aspects of production in-house, including printing, collating, binding, and distribution. As such, they prefer publishing the works of people who come from zine making or self-publishing backgrounds due to their understanding of what is involved in publishing a book and appreciation of the muddier aspects of risograph publishing. So, getting to the conclusion, while there's seemingly a sufficient readership for monthly comics, trade paperbacks, and graphic novels imported from the United States that are sold in comic book shops across Australia, the market has not supported long-term local periodical comics. Any attempts to sell comics through newsagents have also been short-lived. The graphic novel is a relatively new phenomenon in Australia with increasing prominence since the mid-2000s. However, local graphic novels are far from dominating the publishing landscape in Australia. In this context, it is not surprising that comics makers in Australia have become a significant part of the textual communities of the zine scene. It's not noteworthy that Australian comics makers continue to self-publish comics in the zine format, even when they make the transition to becoming professionally published authors with graphic novels under their belt. This is partly due to being part of a long-standing independent arts community in Australia, and partly due to the pleasure and freedom that comes from being involved in all stages of production and distribution of a work, with no restrictions and editorial input. Noteworthy examples include Australian comics and zine maker Simon Hanselman, who has settled in the United States, where he published a series of graphic novels with Fantagraphics, which were also translated into multiple languages. But despite finding success as a graphic novelist, Hanselman, who came from Australia's zine scene, has continued to self-publish zines. So in this paper, what I wanted to present perspectives from a diverse group of zine and comics makers and zine scene organizers. One of the shortcomings of the paper is, I guess, the lack of voices from a younger generation of makers, as most of my interviewees are in their 30s or 40s, which may also point to an aging membership in the community as well. However, many younger people attend zine fairs and get inspired to make their own zines or comics. So future studies may consider how younger creators in the zine community, especially those who attend zine fairs for the first time, describe their experiences of the scene as well. The zine scene continues to provide Australian comics makers a community where they feel they belong. Zine fairs give them spaces to congregate and appreciate each other's works, as well as a chance to connect with their audience. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sean. Thanks very much. We were just reconnecting there. Thanks for a wonderfully detailed study of this community that not many of us will know anything about to that level of detail. So you've informed us mightily along the lines of community over industry. So I'll throw it open to any questions. Now we've got about 12 minutes so for anyone to ask a question of Jean. Okay, you might need to unmute if you're going to ask a question. Yep, Mark.
Hello. I didn't have any questions. I didn't want to fill the silence as an urge to. But I just wanted to say it was a really great talk, and yeah. Really
Mark was one of my interviewees as well. So thanks, Mark.
Oh, nice. Yeah, really exciting.
Stacey, we were having a chat before. Have you got a question, comment for John?
I do have, one question. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. I was wondering, like, what you think, like the growth in, I guess, the zine community, and also with comic artists coming, what you think that might tell us about traditional media, like what might be changing, or whether it's an extra dominance of traditional media that might be spurring that kind of thing, or?
Yeah, thank you. I think the growth is, in a way, maybe a bit of a resistance towards, I guess, the dominance of other forms of media, or like online media. As I was saying in the paper, I mean, there was an expectation in the early 2000s, I guess, that the print media, especially like the zines, might die because, you know, people were actually blogging more. So, you know, people thought, I guess, personal zine makers might turn to blogs more. But I think even though some people, you know, went to creating blogs and used that medium as well, they also stuck to making zines. And there are like people in the Australian zine scenes who continued to make their zines like for over 20 years and kept publishing it, although they, you know, also found other avenues of publishing. So I think partially, while people can find community in online spaces, in online social networks, social media, I think there's maybe a need for these sort of physical media and physical spaces to connect and form communities as well. So I think that shows the growth in the zine scene, shows that there's maybe a bigger demand for that kind of personal connection, physical connection.
Yeah. And sorry, one more question. And what do you think, like, with the expansion of like comic book artists at zine fairs and stuff, and you mentioned about, I guess, like the more designy type zine fairs that had sort of, I guess, taken on a bit more of a commercial impact. Do you think that the comic artists going into those kinds of spaces is having an impact on that sort of activism side, I guess, or that protest side of zines?
Yeah, I think especially when the first Other Worlds Zine Fair, the first couple of years, there were definitely a sense that among the more sort of politically minded comics artists, who also formed like the organizing committee of Other Worlds, so members of the Other Worlds organizing committee. They didn't want to attend MCA Zine Fair, but I remember there were also some conflicts between some of them, because some comic artists actually saw the MCA Zine Fair as a good opportunity for them to meet a different kind of audience. So the MCA Zine Fair, of course, being the Museum of Contemporary Art and being located in Circular Quay in Sydney, attracts like an audience who is used to sort of maybe sort of more, I guess, I don't want to say higher quality necessarily, but I guess glossier or shinier art objects. And so it would give them opportunities to connect with a different kind of audience, maybe, and financially make more of a profit compared to, let's say, a more grassroots kind of zine fair where the expectation would be selling more cheaper stuff. So some people prefer to like make glossier, shinier objects and go to those designy zine fairs to sell them and find a different kind of audience.
Yeah. And do you think like the the bringing in of like, because you mentioned like a lot of the comic artists are sort of, I guess they're more like memoir type, you know, telling their own life stories, as opposed to being necessarily about political subjects. Obviously excluding Safdar's brilliant political works on the refugees. What sort of impact do you think that kind of could have, like, or is having, or is it sort of changing the way that the zine fairs tend to be, I guess, a little bit, yeah, I don't know the right word, less political on that front, because it's more about, I guess, people memoir type things, and, you know, and not necessarily from a political angle?
I think a lot of while there's like memoirs and autobiographical works might be about like mundane daily stuff or everyday lives of people, which in itself could be a political thing. But there's also graphic memoirs and autobiographical works that deal with like political issues as well. So I think they don't necessarily, it's not like it doesn't create an exception. They don't really, they are not mutually exclusive things. So I think a lot of the people I spoke to who make graphic memoirs actually do make some political work too.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you.
Thanks for the questions.
Great.
Yes,
yeah, I guess my question sort of follows on from Stacey's, and that is from my own experience within the zine community, the thing that made it most, I guess, energizing and inspiring was the fact that you were with people who share similar values, and that was a big part of the formation of the Other Worlds Zine Fair, which began in protest, of course, over, as you mentioned, MCA's connections to Transfield and companies with, you know, really bad practices, and the need to be independent from that. And I guess my question is, amongst all the people you surveyed, to what extent were those shared values and ideas, whether it's overtly political in its content or otherwise, to what extent was that a bonding factor? To what extent is it a moral community?
Yeah, definitely. That's a good question. I think there might be a bit of a self-selection bias here, because a lot of the people I interviewed, people who attended Other Worlds Zine Fair over the years, and chosen, I guess, that over, let's say, the MCA Zine Fair. So definitely among the people I surveyed and interviewed, there was that sort of shared moral values and the political stance of resisting against those sort of oppressive and dehumanizing aspects of the company like Transfield and Australia's, detention systems. And it's not just related to, of course, refugee issues, but it was also like a shared understanding of, like an anti-capitalist stance as well. Gender equality, climate activism, like quite a few intersecting and sort of, I guess, for want of a better word, politically progressive issues were shared among people. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Sean, I was just wondering while I was watching this, a lot of people might be surprised that this scene is still flourishing with all these analog objects made with paper. That I remember in the 80s in music, they were very big. But a lot of people would probably think, as you mentioned, from after 2004, a lot of this communal activity would have been replaced by online activity through social media and blogging, etc. Do you think the fact that it is persisting at these fairs and with the production of these analog objects, that in part it's a resistance to that online digital community?
I think so. To some extent it is. I mean, I can, I guess, answer this from a personal perspective as well. I feel like there's a lot of noise, like when you are connected to online media. And it can be quite overwhelming to try and keep up with what's happening online. And there was a time in my life that I was sort of obsessed with following, I don't know, whatever was happening on Twitter, look at the trending topics, or, just this, I guess, obsession with staying constantly connected online. But with, I guess this is the prevalence of the print-based physical media and these communities around it relate to maybe just sort of desire to disconnect a little bit from that overwhelming online sphere, and to basically maybe slow down a bit, to appreciate physical objects, to make connections with other people who share the similar interests and get together, rather than just like chatting online with each other. I mean, which we still do, of course, and we support each other in online social networks as well. But I think there's still a bit of a desire and need to disconnect and get together in person.
Okay, yep, thank you. Any final question? All right, let me just